one instant, a child's trembling voice tore through a billionaire's perfect world, exposing a truth that could have killed him. In the quiet hills of the countryside stood the Hayes estate, an empire built not of stone, but of ambition. At its center was Walter Hayes, a billionaire whose fortune carried more secrets than gold. Each day, his life ran with clockwork precision: breakfast, meetings, and, without fail, tea at 3 o'clock. But on one seemingly ordinary afternoon, something happened that shattered the silence of this perfect world. A maid's young daughter, barely 9 years old, witnessed a moment so fleeting it could have been dismissed as imagination. Yet what she saw would place her face to face with a powerful man's destiny. And just as Walter Hayes raised his cup to his lips, a small voice rang out, "Don't drink that." A little girl's voice was about to shatter a world built on wealth and secrets. This is the story of how a quiet child, armed only with the truth, faced down a powerful man. It began on a day that felt just like any other, but it would end with a lesson no one would ever forget. The Hayes estate was less a home and more a kingdom carved into the rolling green hills of the countryside. A long, winding driveway, paved with stones that seemed to shimmer in the sunlight, led to a mansion of staggering proportions. It was a place of perfect lawns, ancient oak trees, and windows so clean they looked like holes cut into the sky. Inside, the silence was deep and respectful, broken only by the distant hum of a floor polisher or the gentle ticking of a grandfather clock that had been in the Hayes family for a century. This kingdom was ruled by Walter Hayes. At 74, Walter was a man forged from discipline and ambition. He had not been born into this life of unimaginable wealth. He had built it, piece by piece, starting with a small loan and an idea everyone told him was foolish. Now, his name was etched onto skyscrapers and whispered in boardrooms across the country. He was tall and lean, with a full head of silver hair that he kept perfectly combed. His eyes, a pale and piercing blue, missed nothing. They were the eyes of a man who had spent a lifetime reading contracts, and more importantly, reading people. But time had softened his edges in ways money could not. The fire that had driven him in his youth had settled into a low, steady ember. His wife had passed away years ago, and his only son had moved across the world, more interested in finding himself than in running an empire. Walter was surrounded by people, staff, associates, advisors. Yet a profound loneliness clung to him like the morning mist on his sprawling lawns. His days were governed by a strict routine: breakfast at 7, a walk through the gardens at 8, business calls until noon, and at precisely 3 o'clock every afternoon, he would sit in his sun-drenched study for his afternoon tea. It was this ritual that his maid, Evelyn, knew better than anyone. Evelyn was a woman in her late 30s, with a quiet strength and hands that were never still. She had worked for Mr. Hayes for 5 years, ever since her husband, a soldier, had not come home from overseas. Left with a young daughter and a mountain of uncertainty, she had found stability, if not comfort, within the rigid structure of the Hayes estate. She was a good employee, punctual, meticulous, and invisible. She understood that her job was to make the machinery of this grand house run smoothly without ever being noticed. Her entire world, the bright, warm center of her universe, was her 9-year-old daughter, Chloe. Chloe was a wisp of a girl, with hair the color of pale corn silk and eyes as wide and curious as a fawn's. She lived with her mother in a small, tidy cottage tucked away behind the main house, a world apart from the marble floors and crystal chandeliers. Chloe was quiet by nature, content to spend her days with a book or a sketchpad. She saw the grand mansion not as a home, but as a silent museum where her mother worked. She knew the rules: stay out of the way, speak only when spoken to, and never, ever disturb Mr. Hayes. Most of the time, she was happy in her own little world. But there was a story that lived inside her, a legacy passed down from her mother. It was the story of her great-grandfather, Corporal James Miller. He had been a hero in a war fought long before she was born. Her mother would tell her stories of his bravery, not of battles won, but of small, courageous acts. He was the man who shared his rations with a starving family, the man who risked his life to pull a friend from danger. The lesson was always the same. Courage isn't about being the strongest or the loudest, Chloe. It's about doing what's right, especially when it's scary. Chloe held these stories in her heart. They were her most prized possession, a secret well of strength she didn't even know she had. She would often trace the single, faded photograph she had of him, a young man with kind eyes and a determined chin. She felt a connection to him, a duty to live up to the quiet honor of his name. On this particular Tuesday, the air was warm and smelled of freshly cut grass. A special guest was expected at the mansion. His name was Gregory Vance. To the world, Gregory was Walter's nephew, the son of his late sister. But in reality, their relationship was far more complex. Walter had taken Gregory under his wing when he was a young man, funding his education and giving him a high-ranking position in the company. Gregory was handsome, charming, and impeccably dressed. He had a smile that could disarm anyone and a way of speaking that made people feel important. Evelyn didn't like him. She couldn't explain why. It was a feeling, a slight chill in the air whenever he was near. She saw the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the way he looked at Mr. Hayes's possessions with a hunger that felt unsettling. She kept her thoughts to herself, of course. It was not her place to have opinions. Her job was to serve. Chloe, however, saw him differently. To a 9-year-old girl, Gregory was like a prince from a storybook. He always remembered her name and would sometimes bring her a small chocolate, slipping it to her with a conspiratorial wink. "Our little secret," he would say, and she would blush and hide the candy in her pocket. That afternoon, Gregory arrived for a private meeting with Walter. The purpose of the meeting was monumental. Walter, feeling his age and his loneliness more keenly than ever, was planning to officially name Gregory as his successor. The papers were drawn up, sitting in a leather-bound folder on the heavy oak desk in the study. It was a transfer of power, the culmination of Gregory's life's ambition. Evelyn prepared the afternoon tea tray with extra care. She polished the silver teapot until it shone, selected Mr. Hayes's favorite Earl Grey, and arranged a plate of delicate shortbread cookies. She carried the tray to the study, her steps silent on the thick Persian rug. "Thank you, Evelyn," Walter said, not looking up from the documents he was reviewing. "Mr. Hayes." "Mr. Vance," she murmured with a slight nod, setting the tray down on a small table beside Walter's armchair. Gregory gave her a brilliant smile. "It smells wonderful, Evelyn. You're the best." She retreated from the room, pulling the heavy doors closed behind her. Chloe was sitting in the hallway, tucked away in a window seat that overlooked the rose garden. It was one of her favorite hiding spots. She wasn't supposed to be there, but the light was perfect for drawing, and she was sketching the robins that hopped between the thorny bushes. The study doors were so thick that she couldn't hear their words, only a low, indistinct murmur of voices. She was lost in her own world, shading the wing of a bird with her pencil, the scent of lemon oil and old books filling the air. She was so quiet that the two men in the study had no idea she was there. A few minutes passed. The murmur of their conversation continued. Then, one of the study doors opened slightly. Chloe froze, her pencil hovering over the page. She expected to see her mother, or perhaps another member of the staff. Instead, it was Gregory. He didn't come all the way out. He just slipped through the opening, his back to the hallway, and stood for a moment as if listening. He glanced up and down the corridor. His eyes scanned right past the window seat, his mind so focused on his task that he failed to register the small girl curled up there. Convinced he was alone, he turned his attention back to the room. "Just taking a call, Uncle," he said, his voice smooth as silk, directed back toward Walter. "Poor connection in here." He kept the door slightly ajar and pulled his phone from his pocket. But he didn't look at it. His eyes were fixed on the tea tray. Chloe watched, her curiosity piqued. Something about the way he stood, rigid and tense, was different from his usual easygoing manner. His charming smile was gone, replaced by a tight, focused line. He pretended to tap at his phone, his thumbs swiping over a blank screen. His movements were quick and precise. With his other hand, he reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. He was so swift that if Chloe had blinked, she would have missed it. His fingers emerged clutching a tiny glass vial, no bigger than her pinky finger. It was filled with a clear, colorless liquid. Chloe's breath caught in her throat. Her heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. What was that? Gregory's head darted up and down the hall one last time. Seeing nothing, he moved with startling speed. In one fluid motion, he uncapped the vial with a flick of his thumb. He leaned over the tea tray. His hand hovered directly over the delicate porcelain teacup that was waiting for Walter. A few drops of the clear liquid fell, disappearing instantly into the amber tea. There was no splash, no sound. The liquid vanished as if it had never been there at all. He slipped the empty vial back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. Then he picked up the small silver spoon from the saucer and stirred the tea, once, twice. The clinking sound was unnervingly loud in the silent hallway. He placed the spoon back on the saucer, his movements calm and deliberate. He brought the phone to his ear, pretending to finish his call. "Yes, I understand. We'll speak tomorrow," he said to the silent phone. He slipped it back into his pocket and pushed the study door open, stepping back inside. "All sorted," he announced cheerfully. The door clicked shut, plunging the hallway back into silence. Chloe sat frozen in the window seat, her sketchpad lying forgotten in her lap. Her mind struggled to make sense of what she had just seen. It was so fast, so secretive. It felt wrong. A cold knot of fear tightened in her stomach. Why would Mr. Vance put something in his uncle's tea? Maybe it was medicine? But if it was medicine, why would he hide it? Why would he lie about a phone call? She remembered the look on his face when he thought no one was watching. It was not the face of the charming man who gave her chocolates. It was the face of a stranger, cold, calculating, and dangerous. The stories of her great-grandfather flooded her mind. Do what's right, especially when it's scary. Inside the study, Walter Hayes pushed the documents across the desk. "Well, Gregory," he said, his voice carrying a note of finality. "It's all here. As of my signature, you will be in control of the company's future." Gregory's smile was wider and brighter than ever. "Uncle Walter, I don't know what to say. I'm honored. Truly. Just do right by the company," Walter said, leaning back in his chair with a weary sigh. "It's been my life's work." He reached for the teacup. "Now, let's toast to the future." He lifted the cup from its saucer. The warm ceramic felt comforting in his hand. He brought it toward his lips, the fragrant steam warming his face. Outside in the hall, Chloe's heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her ears. The fear was a physical thing, a cold hand wrapped around her chest, squeezing tight. Her mother's face flashed in her mind. She could lose her job. They could be forced to leave. They would have nowhere to go. Who would ever believe a 9-year-old girl over the charming Mr. Vance? But then she saw the image of her great-grandfather, the man with the kind and determined eyes. It wasn't about being believed. It was about doing what was right. Walter's lips were just about to touch the rim of the cup. Chloe scrambled out of the window seat. She didn't think. She just acted. Her small legs carried her to the study doors. She threw her entire weight against them. The heavy wood swung inward with a resounding bang. She stood on the threshold, a small, trembling figure with wide, terrified eyes. Her voice, thin but clear, ripped through the silent room. "Don't drink that." The sound of the heavy doors banging against the wall echoed in the vast study, followed by a silence so complete it felt like the world had stopped turning. For a long moment, no one moved. Walter Hayes was frozen, the delicate porcelain cup held mere inches from his mouth. His pale blue eyes, usually so sharp and analytical, were wide with stunned surprise. He stared at the small girl standing in the doorway, her chest heaving with panicked breaths, her face pale with a terror that was utterly, heartbreakingly real. The words, "Don't drink that," hung in the air, seeming to vibrate with a power far greater than the child who had spoken them. Gregory Vance was the first to break the spell. His head whipped around, his charming smile vanishing as if it had been wiped clean from his face. For a fraction of a second, a look of pure, unadulterated fury flashed in his eyes, so venomous it could have curdled milk. It was there and then gone, replaced instantly by a mask of amused disbelief. He let out a short, forced laugh. "Well," he said, his voice a little too loud, a little too bright. "It seems we have a little dramatist in our midst." Walter slowly, deliberately, lowered the teacup, placing it back on its saucer with a soft clink that sounded like a gunshot in the quiet room. He did not take his eyes off Chloe. He saw not a mischievous child playing a prank, but something else entirely. He had spent over 50 years in boardrooms, facing down liars, cheats, and sycophants. He knew the look of deceit. And this was not it. This was raw, primal fear. Just then, Evelyn rushed into the room, her face white with alarm. She had heard the bang and her daughter's shout from down the hall. "Mr. Hayes, I am so sorry," she stammered, rushing toward Chloe and grabbing her small arm. "Chloe, what on earth do you think you're doing?" Apologize right now. She tried to pull her daughter back into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs. This was it. The end of her job. The end of their home. All because of some childish game. I saw him, Chloe cried, trying to wriggle free from her mother's grip. She pointed a trembling finger at Gregory. He put something in the tea. I saw him do it. Gregory chuckled again, shaking his head as if dealing with a particularly stubborn toddler. Chloe, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. What a vivid imagination you have. You must be reading too many of those fantasy books. He looked at Walter, spreading his hands in a gesture of helplessness. Kids these days. What can you do? I'm not imagining it. Chloe insisted, tears welling in her eyes. It was happening just as she'd feared. No one believed her. He came out into the hall. He pretended to be on the phone, and he took out a little bottle, a glass one, and he poured it in. Evelyn's grip tightened on Chloe's arm. That is enough, she hissed, her voice low and desperate. You will be quiet, and you will say you are sorry for this outrageous lie. She looked at Walter, her eyes pleading. Sir, please forgive her. She doesn't know what she's saying. She must have had a bad dream or... But Walter wasn't looking at Evelyn. His piercing gaze had shifted to his nephew. He watched Gregory's reaction, noting the slight sheen of sweat on his brow, the way his smile seemed stretched too thin across his face. A little bottle? Walter asked, his voice quiet and even. He addressed the question to Chloe, ignoring the other two adults in the room. Chloe nodded frantically, relieved that someone was finally listening. Yes, sir. It was clear. Like glass. And the stuff inside was clear, too. Like water. He put it in your cup, and then he stirred it with the spoon. Every detail she spoke was like a small, sharp stone landing on a scale in Walter's mind. The fake phone call. The secret movement. The stirring. It was too specific, too detailed for a child's fantasy. He had built an empire on his ability to see the patterns others missed, to sense the flaw in a perfect-looking plan. And he sensed a terrible flaw right now. Gregory's composure began to fray at the edges. The charming facade was cracking under the pressure of the old man's silent scrutiny. This is absurd, he snapped, his voice losing its playful edge. Walter, you can't possibly be taking this seriously. She's a 9-year-old girl. Her mother works for you. Perhaps they think this is some way to get attention or more money. The accusation struck Evelyn like a physical blow. No, she gasped, horrified. We would never. Chloe, tell them you made it up. Please, baby, just say you were playing. But Chloe shook her head, tears now streaming down her cheeks. No, Mama. I can't. It's the truth. She looked directly at Walter, her small face a mess of terror and determination. My great-grandpa was a soldier. He won a medal for being brave. Mama always told me, he said that telling the truth is the most important kind of brave. And I'm telling the truth. The mention of a soldier, of bravery and truth, struck a chord deep within Walter Hayes. He came from a generation that revered those words. He had funded veterans' charities for decades. He understood the weight of that legacy. And he saw it now, in the unwavering eyes of this terrified little girl. It was the same look of raw, honest conviction he had seen in young men risking everything for a principle. He contrasted it with the look in his nephew's eyes. In Gregory's, he now saw a frantic, cornered greed. For years, Walter had ignored the small signs of Gregory's impatience, his entitlement, his subtle resentment. He had wanted to see only the charming successor, the boy he had raised to take his place. He had wanted a family, but perhaps he had been blind all along. Gregory, Walter said, his voice deceptively calm. The girl has made a very serious accusation, a very detailed one. And you're choosing to believe her over me? Gregory shot back, his voice rising with incredulity. Over your own family? After everything I've done for you, for this company? What have you done, Gregory? Walter asked, his eyes narrowing. You've done the job I paid you handsomely to do. You've enjoyed a life of privilege that you did not earn. Do not mistake my generosity for a debt I owe you. The steel that had been hidden beneath the weary exterior of the old man was now emerging. The voice that had commanded boardrooms for half a century filled the study. He stood up slowly, his tall frame seeming to expand, to reclaim the authority that was his. He walked around his desk, not toward Chloe, but toward the tea tray. He picked up the cup, holding it in his hand, swirling the contents gently. It's a simple matter to resolve, Walter said, looking directly at Gregory. We'll have the tea tested. My personal physician can be here in 20 minutes. He can send it to a lab. If it's just tea, then the girl was mistaken, and I will deal with that. But if it's not, he let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished but heavy with consequence. Gregory's face went chalky white. The color drained from his skin, leaving it a sickly, waxy pallor. He stared at the teacup in Walter's hand as if it were a venomous snake. All the charm, all the bluster, all the confident indignation evaporated in an instant, leaving behind a stark, ugly fear. "Don't be ridiculous," he stammered, his voice suddenly weak. "There's no need to be so dramatic. It's just a misunderstanding." He took a step toward the door, a desperate, hunted look in his eyes. "I have another appointment. We can discuss this nonsense later." "You will go nowhere," Walter commanded. His voice was not loud, but it had the flat, unyielding finality of a closing vault door. Walter turned and pressed a small, discreet button on his desk. Within moments, a large man in a dark suit entered the room. He was Harold, Walter's head of security and personal driver, a man of few words and unquestionable loyalty. "Harold," Walter said, his voice steady, "please ensure Mr. Vance remains in this room. Do not let him use his phone. And get Dr. Evans on the line. Tell him it's an emergency." Harold simply nodded, his imposing presence blocking the doorway. "Yes, Mr. Hayes." The trap had been sprung. Gregory looked from Walter's resolute face to Harold's impassive one. There was no escape. His shoulders slumped in defeat, the fight draining out of him. He sank into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands, a broken man. The tension in the room finally snapped. Evelyn let out a choked sob, a mixture of shock, terror, and a dawning, unbelievable relief. She looked down at her daughter, who was still trembling but had not backed down. Her small, brave girl. Walter's gaze softened as it fell on Chloe. He walked over to her and knelt down, a gesture that seemed to cost his old knee some effort. He was now at her eye level. The powerful billionaire looked into the tear-streaked face of his maid's daughter. "You said your great-grandfather was a soldier," he said, his voice gentle now. "What was his name?" "James Miller, sir," Chloe whispered, her voice barely audible. "Corporal James Miller." Walter's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition in their depths. "James Miller," he repeated softly, almost to himself. "Of the 101st Airborne?" Chloe nodded, surprised that this powerful man would know that. Walter reached out, his hand hesitating for a moment before he gently placed it on her shoulder. "Your great-grandfather," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she didn't understand, "was a hero. He once saved my older brother's life. I've known that name my whole life." He looked at her, and for the first time, he didn't see the maid's daughter. He saw a legacy. He saw the same quiet courage that had been spoken of in his family for generations. "It seems," Walter Hayes said, his voice cracking ever so slightly, "that a Miller has saved a Hayes once again." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did the right thing, Chloe. You were very, very brave." Chloe buried her face in her mother's side, the scratchy fabric of Evelyn's uniform a comforting reality in a room that had suddenly tilted on its axis. The praise from the powerful Mr. Hayes warmed her, but the fear had not yet receded. She could still feel the cold dread that had seized her in the hallway, the terrifying weight of what she had seen. She held on to her mother tightly, listening to the frantic beat of Evelyn's heart gradually slowing to a more normal rhythm. Evelyn stood frozen, her hand stroking Chloe's silky hair. She was caught in a whirlwind of emotions. The horror of the accusation against her daughter, the terror of losing her livelihood, the shock of Gregory's betrayal, and now, this astonishing, unbelievable connection to a past she only knew from faded photographs and family stories. Walter Hayes knew her grandfather's name. It was too much to comprehend. The study was a tableau of suspended time. Gregory sat slumped in the armchair, guarded by the silent, unmoving form of Harold. The fight had gone out of him completely. He was no longer the charming heir, the confident executive. He was a cornered animal, exposed and defeated, the ugly architecture of his greed laid bare for all to see. He stared at the floor, his face a mask of sullen despair. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken thoughts, heavy with the weight of what had almost happened. Walter Hayes finally broke the stillness. He rose from his knees, the joints protesting with a faint groan, and returned to his place behind the massive oak desk. He sat down, but he did not look at the papers that would have signed away his life's work. He looked at his nephew, and his expression was not one of rage, but of a deep, weary sorrow. It was the look of a man gazing upon the wreckage of something he had spent years building, not a company, but a relationship, a hope for the future. "I trusted you," Walter said, his voice quiet, yet it carried across the room with the force of a physical blow. "I brought you into my home. I gave you my name, my support, my legacy. I treated you as the son I had hoped for." Gregory did not look up. "You gave me a job," he muttered, his voice raspy. "A golden cage. I was always Walter Hayes's nephew, never my own man." "Your own man?" Walter's voice was laced with a cold, sharp irony. "Is this what your own man does? Plots to murder his benefactor for an inheritance he feels is his by right? An inheritance you were hours away from receiving freely." Before Gregory could answer, there was a discreet knock at the door. Harold opened it to admit a man in his early 70s, with a kind, wrinkled face and a doctor's bag in his hand. This was Dr. David Evans, Walter's physician and one of his oldest friends. "Walter?" Harold said. "It was an emergency," Dr. Evans said, his eyes quickly taking in the strange, tense scene. He saw Gregory slumped in the chair, the security man at the door, and the pale-faced maid with her small child. "It is, David," Walter said calmly. He gestured to the tea service. "I need you to take this cup. I have reason to believe its contents have been contaminated. I need a full toxicology screen, expedited. Whatever it costs." Dr. Evans's professional demeanor took over. He looked from the teacup to Gregory's ashen face, and a grim understanding dawned. Without a word, he opened his bag and took out a sterile sample kit. He carefully poured a small amount of the tea into a vial, sealed it, and placed it in a biohazard bag. His movements were precise, methodical, and they seemed to seal Gregory's fate with every practiced gesture. "I'll take this to the lab myself," Dr. Evans said, his voice grave. "I'll call you the moment I have a preliminary result." He gave Walter a look of deep concern. "Are you all right, Walter?" "I am now," Walter said, his gaze flicking toward Chloe. "Thanks to a very brave young lady." The doctor nodded, his eyes resting on Chloe for a moment with a mixture of curiosity and kindness, before he was escorted out by Harold. The moment the door closed, the last sliver of hope seemed to abandon Gregory. The finality of the evidence being taken away, the quiet professionalism of the doctor, it was the end of the line. He let out a dry, rattling sob. "You were going to change the will," he choked out, finally looking up at Walter. His face was blotchy and contorted with a pathetic, self-pitying rage. "Don't deny it. I heard you on the phone with the lawyers last week. You were talking about a new philanthropic foundation. Your legacy. That was my money. My legacy. The money you promised me." Walter listened, his expression hardening into stone. "I was considering rewriting my will. Yes," he admitted. "I was going to dedicate the bulk of my fortune to medical research and education. I was going to leave you a generous trust, Gregory. More money than you could ever spend. But the company needs a leader, not a leech. And in the past year, I have seen you for what you are. Impatient, entitled, weak." Gregory spat, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "It doesn't take weakness to do what I was about to do. It takes nerve." "No," Walter countered, his voice like ice. "It takes cowardice. The poison was a coward's tool. Something you hoped would be mistaken for a simple heart attack in an old man. No mess. No fuss. Just a tidy path to the chairman's seat. You couldn't build an empire like mine, so you decided to steal it instead." The raw, ugly truth of it silenced Gregory. He had nothing left to say. He had gambled everything and lost in the most humiliating way possible, undone by a silent little girl he hadn't even noticed. Walter pressed the button on his desk again. "Harold," he said into the intercom, "call the police. Tell them to come to the main entrance." The arrival of two uniformed police officers was a surreal intrusion into the opulent study. They were calm, respectful, but their presence brought with it the unassailable authority of the law. They listened as Walter, in a few concise sentences, explained the situation. The attempted murder, the witness, the confession. Gregory didn't resist as they handcuffed him. He seemed to shrink before their eyes, all his tailored elegance and feigned confidence dissolving into the shabby reality of a common criminal. As they led him from the room, he paused at the doorway and looked back. His eyes were filled with a burning hatred, and they were fixed not on Walter, but on Chloe. Evelyn instinctively pulled her daughter closer, shielding her from the venom in his gaze. Then he was gone, and the heavy door clicked shut, leaving a profound and ringing silence in his wake. For a long moment, the only sound was Evelyn's quiet, shaky breathing. The ordeal was over. The danger had passed. Walter Hayes sank back into his leather chair, the strength that had carried him through the last hours suddenly deserting him. He looked every one of his 74 years, a fragile, betrayed old man, lost in the cavernous room that was meant to be his fortress. Evelyn, sensing the shift, knew it was time to disappear again. Her role in this drama was over. "Sir," she began, her voice barely a whisper. "We'll go now? I'll take Chloe back to the cottage." "No." Walter's voice was soft, but it held a command she could not disobey. He lifted his head and looked at them, truly looked at them, not as a master to his servants, but as one human being to another. "Please sit down, both of you." He gestured to the two plush armchairs that faced his desk, the same chairs where corporate giants and world leaders had sat. Hesitantly, Evelyn guided Chloe to one, then perched nervously on the edge of the other. They looked small and out of place amidst the grandeur. Walter took a deep breath, letting it out slowly. "Evelyn," he began, "I cannot begin to express. My gratitude is not a strong enough word for what your daughter did today. She was just." Evelyn started, but Walter held up a hand. "She was courageous," he said firmly. "And she was honorable. You have raised a remarkable child." He then turned his full attention to Chloe, who watched him with wide, solemn eyes. "I wasn't exaggerating, you know," he said gently. "About your great-grandfather. My older brother, Richard, was his commanding officer. During a shelling, the roof of their bunker collapsed. Richard was trapped, his leg pinned under a fallen beam. Everyone else was ordered to evacuate, but James Miller refused to leave him. He dug my brother out with his bare hands while the shells were still falling. He saved his life, at great risk to his own." He paused, a distant look in his eyes. "My family tried to find him after the war. We wanted to thank him properly, to help him in any way we could. But he was a humble man. He'd been discharged and simply disappeared back into civilian life. We never found him. It has been a regret of my father's, and mine, for over 60 years. He looked at Chloe, a faint, sad smile on his lips. "To think that his great-granddaughter was living on my property all this time. Fate has a strange sense of humor." He leaned forward, his hands clasped on the desk. "Today, you showed that same courage. You saw something wrong, and you spoke up, even when you were afraid, even when you thought no one would believe you, even when you risked getting into terrible trouble. That, Chloe Miller, is the definition of integrity." He looked from Chloe to her mother, and a new resolve entered his eyes, replacing the weariness. "This changes things," he said simply. "Everything." Evelyn stared at Walter Hayes, her mind struggling to catch up with the words he was saying. She had spent the last 5 years of her life tiptoeing through this house, her primary goal being to remain unnoticed, to clean and polish and fade into the background. She was the maid, a functional part of the estate's machinery. To be asked to sit in these chairs, to be spoken to as an equal, was disorienting. To be told that everything was about to change was terrifying. "Sir, I don't understand," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "If I've done something wrong." "Evelyn," Walter interrupted gently, but with an authority that quelled her protest. "You have done nothing wrong. You have done everything right. You have raised a daughter with more character and integrity than a boardroom full of men I know. And that is why things must change." He leaned back in his chair, his fingertips forming a steeple under his chin. His gaze was clear and resolute. The weary, betrayed man of an hour ago was gone, replaced by the decisive visionary who had built an empire from nothing. "Your employment here, in its current form, is terminated," he stated. Evelyn's heart plummeted. She felt the blood drain from her face. Terminated. It was the word she had dreaded for 5 years. She opened her mouth to plead, to ask for another chance. But he continued before she could speak. "It's terminated because it is no longer appropriate," he went on. "From this moment on, you and Chloe are not my staff. You are my responsibility. More than that." He paused, searching for the right word. "You are my guests. Permanently. You are, in a sense, the family of a man who saved my family. That is a debt of honor that has gone unpaid for far too long. He stood and walked to the large window that overlooked the sprawling gardens. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns. That little cottage behind the gardens, he said, his back to them. It is not a suitable home. The west wing of this house has been empty for a decade, ever since my son moved abroad. It has its own entrance, a kitchen, 5 bedrooms. It's a home, not just a set of rooms. I would consider it a personal favor if you would consent to live there. As my neighbors. Evelyn was speechless. She looked at Chloe, who was listening with a child's unfiltered curiosity, her fear finally giving way to a sense of wonder. The West Wing. They had cleaned it once a month. It was bigger than any house she had ever been in. But, my job, Evelyn finally managed to whisper. I have to work. I can't accept charity. Her pride, the bedrock of her survival for so many years, would not allow it. Walter turned back to face her, a flicker of a smile on his face. I am not offering charity, Evelyn. I am offering you a promotion. I mentioned I was on the phone with my lawyers about a new foundation, a philanthropic endeavor focused on providing educational scholarships to the children of veterans. It seems my previous candidate for running it has become unavailable. His eyes twinkled with a hint of dry humor. The foundation will need an executive director, someone to manage its operations, to review applications, to ensure the money goes to those who truly deserve it. It requires someone with integrity, someone who understands hardship, and someone with a deep, personal connection to the military community. I can think of no one more qualified than the mother of Chloe Miller. He named a salary that made Evelyn gasp. It was more than she had made in the last 5 years combined. This was too much. A new home, a new career, a new life. It was a fairy tale, a dream from which she was sure she would soon awaken. She felt tears welling up, tears of shock and overwhelming gratitude. She looked at her daughter, this quiet, observant little girl who had done nothing more than tell the truth, and she saw the architect of this impossible new reality. Walter then knelt once more in front of Chloe. And as for you, young lady, he said, his voice soft and full of warmth. Your mother and I will be business colleagues, but you and I have a more important job to do. We do? Chloe asked, her voice small. Yes, he said, his expression serious. We need to make sure you have the best education in the world, so you can grow up to be whatever you want to be. A doctor, an artist, a scientist, maybe even the CEO of a company, if you like. But you'll do it the right way, by building, not by taking. He explained that he was setting up a trust in her name. It would pay for the best schools, for tutors, for books, for any and every opportunity she could ever dream of. It was not a gift, he explained. It was an investment. An investment in the future of a family that his own family had owed for more than half a century. Chloe didn't understand the words trust or investment, but she understood the kindness in the old man's eyes. She understood that the knot of fear that had lived in her stomach for so long was finally gone. She thought for a moment, processing his grand offer of education and opportunity, and then asked the one question that was on her 9-year-old mind. Does this mean, she asked, her voice barely a whisper, that I can use the big swimming pool? For the first time that day, Walter Hayes threw back his head and laughed. It was not a small, polite chuckle, but a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the grand study. It was the sound of a window being thrown open in a room that had been sealed shut for far too long. Yes, Chloe, he said, his eyes shining. It means you can use the swimming pool whenever you want. 3 months later, the Hayes estate felt like a different place. The deep, respectful silence had been replaced by a new kind of life. Sometimes, it was the sound of Chloe's laughter as she chased a squirrel across the lawn. Other times, it was the cheerful tapping of Evelyn's keyboard from her new office in what used to be a dusty, forgotten parlor. Evelyn had blossomed in her new role. Dressed in smart business clothes, she moved through the world with a confidence she never knew she possessed. She was no longer invisible. She was the director of the Miller Hayes Foundation, a title that filled her with a profound sense of purpose. She spent her days helping families just like hers, turning the legacy of her grandfather's courage into a tangible force for good. Chloe was enrolled in the finest private school in the state. She was shy at first, intimidated by the other children who came from lives of effortless privilege. But she had a quiet strength that drew people to her. And she had a secret weapon. Every evening, she would do her homework in the vast library, sitting at the long mahogany table. And across from her, Walter Hayes would sit, reading his own papers, but always ready to help her with a tricky math problem or to explain a long word in her history book. He had become the grandfather she'd never had. He taught her how to play chess, and she, in turn, taught him the names of all the different birds that visited the gardens. His morning walks were no longer solitary affairs. A small girl with corn silk hair now walked beside him, her hand often tucked into his, chattering away about her day. She had not only saved his life, she had given it back to him. She had filled the empty spaces in his home and in his heart. The loneliness that had clung to him for years had finally lifted, replaced by the simple, profound joy of watching a child grow. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat by the edge of the now-famous swimming pool, Chloe looked up at him. "Mr. Hayes," she asked, "are you happy I yelled at you that day?" Walter looked out over the sparkling water, a gentle smile on his face. He thought of Gregory, who was now facing a long and certain prison sentence. He thought of the teacup, the poison, the life he had almost lost. And then he thought of everything he had gained. "Chloe," he said, turning to look her in the eye, "every day, I thank God you did. You reminded me of something I had forgotten." "What's that?" she asked. "That the greatest fortunes in this world have nothing to do with money," he said. "They have to do with courage, with honor, and with having someone in your life who is brave enough to tell you the truth." He reached over and gently patted her hand. In the quiet of the grand estate, a bond had been forged, not of wealth or power, but of a shared history and a second chance. And for the old billionaire and the maid's young daughter, it was the beginning of a story far richer than any empire. The air in the study, once thick with tension, now hummed with a different kind of energy. The dramatic departure of Gregory Vance and the police left behind a silence that was more profound than the one that had existed before. It was a silence filled with the weight of everything that had just occurred. Walter Hayes, the powerful man who had faced down countless foes in his long life, sat in his large chair, looking suddenly small and very, very old. The strength that had carried him through the confrontation with his nephew seemed to have dissolved, leaving him with only a deep, weary sorrow. He had stared into the heart of betrayal and found it where he least expected, in the person he had groomed to be his successor. Across from him, Evelyn and Chloe were a portrait of shared shock and exhaustion. Evelyn, her hand still protectively on Chloe's shoulder, was on the verge of tears, her mind reeling from the past hour's events. Her daughter, a small, trembling figure in the grand, intimidating room, was the only thing that felt real. Her quiet heroism, the simple, unassailable truth she had spoken, had unraveled a lifetime of deceit and saved a man's life. Evelyn looked at her daughter and felt a surge of fierce, protective pride so strong it made her knees weak. Walter, seeing their state, felt a new emotion stirring within him, one that had been foreign for years: responsibility. He had always provided for his staff, but it had been a transactional relationship. Now, looking at this mother and daughter, he saw a different kind of debt. "No," he said, his voice soft but firm, when Evelyn suggested they leave. "Please sit down, both of you." He gestured to the two plush armchairs that faced his desk, the same chairs where he had negotiated deals worth billions. Hesitantly, Evelyn guided Chloe to one, then perched nervously on the edge of the other. As they sat there, two small figures in the vast, opulent room, Walter took a deep breath. "Evelyn," he began, his voice laced with a genuine humility that was rare for him, "I cannot begin to express. My gratitude is not a strong enough word for what your daughter did today." Evelyn started to mumble a protest, something about Chloe just being a child, but Walter raised a hand to stop her. "She was courageous," he said, his eyes fixed on Chloe. "And she was honorable. You have raised a remarkable child." He turned his full attention to the little girl, who watched him with wide, solemn eyes. "I wasn't exaggerating, you know, about your great-grandfather. My older brother, Richard, was his commanding officer." A faint, sad smile touched Walter's lips as he spoke of the past. He told them the story of Corporal James Miller, the man who had risked his own life to save his brother during a brutal shelling attack. He spoke of his family's enduring regret, their decades-long search for the humble soldier who had disappeared back into civilian life after the war. To think that his great-granddaughter was living on my property all this time, he said softly, a look of awe on his face. Fate has a strange sense of humor. He then looked directly at Chloe, his eyes full of respect. Today, you showed that same courage. You saw something wrong, and you spoke up, even when you were afraid, even when you thought no one would believe you. That, Chloe Miller, is the definition of integrity. A new resolve entered his eyes, replacing the weariness. This changes things, he said simply. Everything. Evelyn's heart sank, her mind immediately jumping to the worst conclusion. Sir, I don't understand, she said, her voice trembling slightly. If I've done something wrong. Walter interrupted her gently. You have done nothing wrong. You have done everything right. You have raised a daughter with more character than a boardroom full of men I know. And that is why things must change. He leaned back in his chair, a decisive visionary once again. Your employment here, in its current form, is terminated, he stated. Evelyn felt the blood drain from her face, but before she could plead, he continued. It's terminated because it is no longer appropriate, he said, his voice as calm as a summer lake. From this moment on, you and Chloe are not my staff. You are my responsibility. You are my guests. Permanently. He stood and walked to the large window, looking out over the perfectly manicured lawn. That little cottage behind the gardens is not a suitable home. The west wing of this house has been empty for a decade. It's a home, not just a set of rooms. I would consider it a personal favor if you would consent to live there. As my neighbors. Evelyn was speechless, the words a jumbled mix of absurdity and impossible kindness in her mind. But, my job, she finally managed to whisper, her pride refusing the offer of what felt like charity. Walter turned back to her with a smile. I am not offering charity, Evelyn. I am offering you a promotion. He explained his plan to establish a philanthropic foundation dedicated to providing educational scholarships to the children of veterans, and offered her the position of executive director. I can think of no one more qualified than the mother of Chloe Miller, he said, naming a salary that made Evelyn gasp. The shock and gratitude were overwhelming. She looked at her daughter, this quiet girl who had done nothing more than tell the truth, and she saw the architect of this impossible new reality. Walter then knelt once more in front of Chloe. And as for you, young lady, he said, your mother and I will be business colleagues, but you and I have a more important job to do. He promised to provide her with the best education in the world, setting up a trust in her name. It's an investment, he explained, in the future of a family that my own family has owed for more than half a century. Chloe, not fully grasping the grand pronouncements, had only one question. Does this mean, she asked, her voice a tiny whisper, that I can use the big swimming pool? For the first time all day, Walter Hayes threw back his head and laughed. It was a deep, genuine laugh that echoed through the grand study, the sound of a heart long dormant finally coming back to life. Yes, Chloe, he said, his eyes shining. It means you can use the swimming pool whenever you want. 3 months later, the Hayes estate felt like a different place. The deep, respectful silence had been replaced by a new kind of life. It was the sound of Chloe's laughter as she chased a squirrel, or the cheerful tapping of Evelyn's keyboard from her new office in the West Wing. Evelyn had blossomed in her new role. Dressed in smart business clothes, she moved through her world with a confidence she never knew she possessed. She was no longer invisible. She was the director of the Miller Hayes Foundation, a title that filled her with a profound sense of purpose. She spent her days helping families just like hers, turning the legacy of her grandfather's courage into a tangible force for good. Chloe was enrolled in the finest private school in the state. She was shy at first, but her quiet strength and observant nature drew people to her. Every evening, she would do her homework in the vast library, and across from her, Walter Hayes would sit, always ready to help with a tricky math problem or to explain a long word in her history book. He had become the grandfather she'd never had, and she had given him the family he had long lost hope of having. His morning walks were no longer solitary affairs. A small girl with corn-silk hair walked beside him, her hand often tucked into his, chattering away about her day. She had not only saved his life, she had given it back to him. The profound loneliness that had clung to him for years had finally lifted, replaced by the simple, profound joy of watching a child grow. One crisp autumn afternoon, as they sat by the edge of the now famous swimming pool, Chloe looked up at him. "Mr. Hayes," she asked, "are you happy I yelled at you that day?" Walter looked out over the sparkling water, a gentle smile on his face. He thought of the teacup, the poison, the life he had almost lost, and then he thought of everything he had gained. "Chloe," he said, turning to look her in the eye, "every day, I thank God you did. You reminded me of something I had forgotten." "What's that?" she asked. "That the greatest fortunes in this world have nothing to do with money," he said. "They have to do with courage, with honor, and with having someone in your life who is brave enough to tell you the truth." He reached over and gently patted her hand. In the quiet of the grand estate, a bond had been forged, not of wealth or power, but of a shared history and a second chance. And for the old billionaire and the maid's young daughter, it was the beginning of a story far richer than any empire. And that's where we'll end the story for now. Whenever I share one of these, I hope it gives you a chance to step out of the everyday and just drift for a bit. I'd love to know what you were doing while listening. Maybe relaxing after work, on a late-night drive, or just winding down. Drop a line in the comments. I really do read them all. And if you want to make sure we cross paths again, hitting like and subscribing makes a huge difference. Thanks for spending this time with me.